Preface of Pathological Lying, Accusation, and Swindling. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mary Schneider. Pathological Lying, Accusation, and Swindling by William and Mary Healy. Preface. Careful studies of offenders make group types stand out with distinctness. Very little advancement in the treatment of delinquents or criminals can be expected if typical characteristics and their bearings are not understood. The group that our present work concerns itself with is comparatively little known, although cases belonging to it, when met, attract much attention. It is to all who should be acquainted with these striking mental and moral vagaries, particularly in their forensic and psychological significances, that our essay is addressed. In some cases, vital for the administration of justice, an understanding of the types of personality and of behavior here under discussion is a prime necessity. The whole study of characterology, or the motivation of conduct, is extremely new, and there are many indications of immense values in uncovered fields. Some appreciation of this fact may be gained from the following pages, which show the possibility of tracing one form of behavior to its source. We have laid under contribution practically the entire literature on the subject, almost none of which is in English, and also the thoroughgoing longitudinal case studies made by the Juvenile Psychopathic Institute of Chicago. In the latter material there was found much of value bearing upon the subject of lying, false accusation, and swindling of pathological character. Our institute, later taken over officially by the Juvenile Court of Cook County, was for 5 years maintained upon a foundation provided by Mrs. W. F. Dummer. Signed William Healy and Mary Tenney Healy, Winnetka, Illinois, June 1915. End of preface. Chapter 1, Introduction of Pathological Lying, Accusation, and Swindling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pathological Lying, Accusation, and Swindling by William and Mary Healy. Chapter 1, Introduction. Through comparison of the literature on pathological lying and our own extensive material, we are led to perceive the insistent necessity for closer definition of the subject than has been heretofore offered. Reasons for excluding types earlier described as pathological liars will be found throughout our work. Better definition goes hand in hand with better understanding, and it is only natural that formal, detailed contemplation of the subject should lead to seeing new lines of demarcation. Definition. Pathological lying is falsification entirely disproportionate to any discernible end in view, engaged in by a person who at the time of observation cannot definitely be declared insane, feeble-minded, or epileptic. Such lying rarely, if ever, centers about a single event. Although exhibited in very occasional cases for a short time, it manifests itself most frequently by far over a period of years, or even a lifetime. It represents a trait rather than an episode. Extensive, very complicated fabrications may be evolved. This has led to the synonyms mythomania, pseudologia fantastica. It is true that in the previous literature, under the head of pathological liars, cases of epilepsy, insanity, and mental defect have been cited, but that is misleading. A clear terminology should be adopted. The pathological liar forms a species by himself, and as such does not necessarily belong to any of these larger classes. It is, of course, scientifically permissible, as well as practically valuable, to speak of the epileptic or the otherwise abnormal person, through his disease, engaging in pathological lying. But the main classification of an individual should be decided by the main abnormal condition. A good definition of pathological accusation follows the above lines. It is false accusation indulged in apart from any obvious purpose. Like the swindling of pathological liars, it appears objectively more pernicious than the lying, but it is an expression of the same tendency. The most striking form of this type of conduct is, of course, self-accusation. Mendacious self-impeachment seems especially convincing of abnormality. Such falsification not infrequently is episodic. The inclusion of swindling in our discussion is due to the natural evolution of this type of conduct from pathological lying. Swindling itself could hardly be called a pathological phenomenon, since it is readily explicable by the fact that it is entered into for reasons of tangible gain, but when it is the product of the traits shown by a pathological liar, it, just like the lying itself, is part of the pathological picture. It is the most concrete expression of the individual's tendencies. This has been agreed to by several writers, for all have found it easy to trace the development of one form of behavior into the other. As Wolfen says, Die Gabe zu schwindeln ist eine Lust am Fabulieren. Over and over again we have observed the phenomenon as the pathological liar gradually developed the tendency to swindle. Notwithstanding the grave and sensational social issues which arise out of pathological lying, accusation, and swindling, there is very little acquaintance with the characteristics of cases showing this type of behavior, even by the people most likely to meet the problems presented. Lawyers or other professional specialists have slight knowledge of the subject. Perhaps this is due to the fact that the pathological lying does not follow the usual lines of abnormal human behavior, unless it be among the insane, where other symptoms proclaim the true nature of the case. Another reason for the slight acquaintance with the subject is the fact that almost nothing has been written on it in English. The important part which behavior of this type sometimes plays in our court work is witnessed to by the records of our own cases, as well as those cited in the previous literature. The legal issues presented by pathological lying may be exceedingly costly. These facts make it important that the well-equipped lawyer, as well as the student of abnormal psychology, be familiar with the specific related facts. For such students, the cardinal point of recognition of this class of conduct may at once be stated to be its apparent baselessness. The only method by which good understanding may be obtained of the types of personality and mentality involved in pathological lying, accusation, and swindling, as well as the genetics of these tendencies, is by the detailed reading of typical case histories. In this fact is found the reason for the presentation of this monograph. Appreciation of the nature of the phenomena can only be obtained through acquaintance with an entire career. Any of us may be confronted by fabrications so consistent as to leave at one or several interviews the impression of truth. Our selection of literature to summarize needs no explanation. We have simply taken all that we could find which specifically bears on the problem. Lying in general, especially as a form of delinquency, has received attention at the hands of some authors, notably Ferriani and Duprat. The falsifications and fantasies of children and adolescents have been dealt with by Stanley Hall. None of these goes into the important narrower field with which we are here concerned. The foreign literature is vitally important in its opening up of the subject, but from the standpoint of modern psychopathology, it does not adequately cover the ground. The fabrications, often quite clever, of the clearly insane, which in earlier literature are confounded with pathological lying, we have discriminated against as not being profitable for us to discuss here, while not denying, however, the possibility in some instances of lies coexisting with actual delusions. We well remember a patient, a brilliant conversationalist and letter writer, but an absolutely frank case of paranoia, whom we had not seen for a period during which she had concocted a new set of notions involving even her own claim to royal blood, confronting us with a merry, significant smile and the remark, "You don't believe my stories, do you?" A short statement on the relation of lying to delinquency may be of interest here. Veriani's discussion of the lying of 500 condemned juvenile offenders, with classification of their lies ranging from self-defense, weakness, and fancy to nobility of purpose, does not include our field. Nor does he leave much room for appreciation of the fact we very definitely have observed, namely, that plenty of young offenders are robust speakers of the truth. Our analysis of the delinquencies of 1,000 young repeat offenders, carefully studied by us, does not tell the proportion of truth-tellers as distinguished from liars, but it does give the number in which lying was a notable and excessive trait. The total number of males studied was 694, of females 306. Ages ranged from 6 to 22, average age 16 years. Lying, counted only when excessive and a notorious characteristic of the individual, appeared in 104 cases for males, 15% of the sample, and in 80 females, 26% of the sample. False accusations, only recorded when of an excessive and dangerous sort, appeared 5 times among males, 0.7%, and 16 times among the females, 5%. The exact number of pathological liars is not determinable in our series because of the shading of this lying into other types. It would be safe to say that 8 or 10 of the 1,000 were genuine cases of pathological lying according to our definition, that 5 more engaged in pathological false accusations without a notorious career in other kinds of lying. Examples of borderline mental cases showing fantastic lying and accusations are given in our special chapter. Some of the cases of pathological lying given in this work do not belong to the series of 1,000 cases analyzed for statistical purposes. The extraordinary number of times several of these individuals appeared in court, resembling in this respect the European case histories, shows that the total amount of trouble caused by this class is not in the least represented by their numerical proportion among offenders. We have purposely limited our own material for presentation. Here, as elsewhere, we insist on the value of genetics, and consequently have busied ourselves at length with those cases where we could gain something like an adequate conception of the antecedents in family and developmental histories, and where some measure of the psychogenetic features could be taken. Cases of older individuals with their prolonged and often picturesque careers, equivalent to those recounted in European literature, we have left strictly alone. One ever finds that the older the individual, the less one can learn satisfactorily of beginnings of tendencies, just on account of the unreliability of the principal actor in the drama. The cases of older swindlers, at first sight, seem to offer much for the student of criminalistics, if only for purely descriptive purposes, but in the literature we have failed to find any satisfactory studies of the formative years of such careers. By taking instances of younger pathological liars, such as we have studied, the natural progress into swindling can be readily seen. In court work we have been brought face to face with many cases of false accusation, and of course with plenty of the usual kind of lying. Where either of these had been entered into by way of revenge or in belief that it would aid in getting out of trouble, no further attention has been paid to it from the standpoint of pathological lying. Our acquaintance with some professional criminals, particularly of the sneak thief or pickpocket class, has taught us that living conditions for the individual may be founded on whole careers of misrepresentation and lies, for very understandable reasons. Self-accusations may sometimes be evolved with the idea of gaining directly practical results, as when a lover or a comrade is shielded, or when there is a danger of a larger crime being fastened on the self-incriminator. In selection and treatment of our material, we have confined ourselves as closely as possible to the definition first given in this chapter, a definition that after some years of observation we found could be made and held to. While we would not deny that some of our cases may eventually find their way into an insane hospital, still none of them, except some we have enumerated under the name of borderline types, has so far shown any indication of this. That some of our cases have more or less recovered from a strongly marked and prolonged inclination to falsify is a fact of great importance for treatment and prognosis. We see neither reason for including insane cases nor for overlapping the already used classifications, which are based on more vital fact than the symptom of lying. Our use of abnormal cases in our chapter, Illustrations of Borderline Types, will be perfectly clear to those who read these cases. They represent the material not easily diagnosed, sometimes after long observation by professional people, or else they are clearly abnormal individuals who, by the possession of certain capacities, manage to keep their heads well above the level of social incompetency as judged by the world at large. We have introduced only the cases where we have had ample proof that the individual had been given to excessive lying of our peculiar type. In the courtroom and working with delinquents outside the court, it is in rare instances totally impossible to know where the truth finally rests. Such have been left out. Then, too, we omit cases in which false accusations have about them the shadow of even a suspicion of vindictiveness. False accusations of young children against parents would hardly seem to have such a basis, and yet in some instances this fact has come out clearly. Grudge formation on the part of young individuals has all through our work been one of the extraordinary findings. Capacity for it varies tremendously in different individuals. Several forms of excessive lying, particularly those practiced by children and adolescents, are not discussed by us because they are largely age phenomena and only verge upon the pathological as they are carried over into wider fields of conduct. The fantasies of children and the almost obsessional lying in some young adolescents, too, we avoid. There is much shading of typical pathological lying into, on the one hand, the really insane types, and on the other hand, into the lying which is to be explained by quite normal reactions, or where the tendency to mendacity is only partially developed. It has been a matter of no small interest to us that in planning this monograph we conceived it necessary to consider part of our material under the head of episodic pathological lying, and that later we had to omit this chapter. Surely there had been cases, so it seemed to us at first, where purposeless lying had been indulged in for a comparatively short time, particularly during the adolescent period, without expression of a prevaricating tendency before or after this time. When we came to review our material with this chapter in mind, we found no sufficient verification of the fact that there was any such thing as episodic pathological lying, apart from peculiar manifestations in cases of epilepsy, hysteria, and other mental abnormalities. A short career of extensive lying, not infrequently met with in work for juvenile courts and other social agencies, seems, judging from our material, to be always so mixed up with other delinquencies or unfortunate sex experiences that the lying, after all, cannot be regarded as purposeless. It is indulged in most often to attempt to disguise undesirable truths. That false accusations and even self-accusations are engaged in for the same purpose goes without saying. The girl who donned man's clothes, left home, and lived for months a life of lies was seeking an adventure which would offset intolerable home conditions. The young woman who, after seeing something of the pleasures of the world, was placed in a strict religious home where she told exaggerated stories about her own bad behavior, was endeavoring to get more freedom elsewhere. A young fellow whom we found to be a most persistent and consistent liar was discovered to have been already well schooled in the art of professional criminalistic self-protection. So it has gone, Investigation of each of these episodic cases has shown the fabrications to emanate either from a distinctly abnormal personality or to partake of a character which rules them out of the realm of pathological lying. In our cases of temporary adolescent psychoses, lying was rarely found a puzzling feature. The basic nature of the case was too easily discoverable. A fair question to ask at this point is whether pathological lying is ever found to be the only delinquency of the given individual. We should hesitate to deny the possibility of its being the sole offense, but in our study of a long list of cases, and after review of those reported by other authors, it seems practically impossible to find a case of this. The tendencies soon carry the person over to the production of other delinquencies, and if these do not come in the category of punishable offenses, at least through the trouble and suffering caused others, they are to be regarded essentially as misconduct. The reverse of the above question deserves a word or two of attention. Are there marked cases of delinquency which do not show lying? Surveying the figures of Ferriani, who enumerated thousands of lies belonging to his 9 classes of prevarications, which a group of 500 young offenders indulged in, one would think that all delinquents are liars many times over. But as a matter of fact, we have been profoundly astonished to discover that a considerable percentage of the cases we have studied, even of repeated offenders, have proved notably truthful. Occasionally, the very person who will engage in a major form of delinquency will hesitate to lie. Our experience shows this to be less true, however, of sex delinquency than perhaps of any other. This statement is based on general observations. The accurate correlations have not been worked out. Occasionally, the professional criminal of many misdeeds is proud of his uprightness in other spheres of behavior, including veracity. But even here one would have to classify carefully, for it is obvious that the typical swindler would find lying his best cloak of disguise. On the other hand, a bold safe-blower may look down with scorn upon a form of criminality which demands constant mendacity. Realizing that pathological lying is a type of delinquency, and following the rule that for explanation of conduct tendencies one must go to youthful beginnings, we have attempted to gain the fullest possible information about the fundamentals of developmental and family history, early environment, and early mental experiences. Fortunately, we have often been able to obtain specific and probably accurate data on heredity. The many cases which have been only partially studied are not included. Successive cross-section studies have been made in a number of cases, and it has been possible to get a varying amount of after history. Observational, historical, and analytical data thus accumulated have given us a particularly favorable opportunity for discerning the bases of this special delinquent tendency. The results of the various kinds of social treatment which have been undertaken are not the least interesting of our facts. To enumerate the results obtained on the many mental tests given in most cases seems quite unnecessary for the purpose of this monograph. We have referred to a few points of special interest and rarely have designated the results on tests in our series. In general, the reader probably will be better off with merely the statement of the principal findings and of the mental diagnosis. Of much interest for the present subject is the development of psychological studies of testimony or report. Because of the natural expectation that the pathological liar might prove to be an unreliable witness, our studies on this point will be offered in detail. For years we have been giving a picture memory test on the order of one used extensively abroad. This Aussage test is the one described as Test 6 in our monograph on practical mental classification. More recently, our studies on the psychology of testimony have led us into wider fields of observation, and here the group of cases now under discussion may have to stand by themselves. The picture, the record of testimony on which is given in some detail in our case histories, is that of a butcher's shop with objects and actions that are universally comprehended. After careful and fair explanation of what is about to be undertaken, the picture is exposed for 10 seconds, and then the examinee is asked to give a free recital of all he saw. When he states that no more is remembered, he is questioned on omitting details. All told, there are about 50 details of varying importance in the picture. During the progress of this part of the examination, he is asked if he saw 7 objects which might well be in a butcher shop, but which are not in the picture. This is the test for susceptibility to suggestion. All points are carefully scored. Norms on this test, as on many others, it seems hardly fair to give by averages. There is much variation according to mentality and even personality groups. Practically all of our cases of pathological lying range above the age of young childhood, so it is not necessary here to discuss the characteristics of young children's testimony. Perhaps it is sufficient to say that the ordinary individual recalls voluntarily or upon questioning upwards of 20 items, and does not give incorrect items to any extent. On questioning, he may perhaps accept 1 or 2 of the 7 suggestions, but when details in general are asked for, he does not add fictional items more than are accounted for by some slip of memory. One can find definite types of intellectual honesty, even among children of 10 to 12 years of age, when there is no tampering with the truth. If an item has not been observed, there is no effort to make it seem otherwise. For discussion of the results on this test among our pathological liars, we refer to our chapter on conclusions. The short summary of causative factors given at the end of the case study deals only with the factors of delinquency. To avoid misinterpretation of the coordinated facts, what they focused upon should ever be remembered. The statement of these ascertained factors brings out many incidental points which should be of interest to lawyers and other students of criminalistics. It should be needless to state to our professional readers that the personalities represented in our case histories are entirely fictitious, but that alterations have been made only in such facts as will not impair scientific values. We confess to no particular pleasure in writing up this rather sordid material. The task is undertaken because such studies offer the only way to gain that better understanding which is necessary for adequate treatment of special types of human beings. End of introduction. Read by Mary Schneider. Of pathological lying, accusation, and swindling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Pathological Lying, Accusation, and Swindling by William and Mary Healy. Chapter 2. Previous Studies. The subject of pathological lying was first definitely brought to the attention of the medical and legal professions by the studies of Delbruck. The aim of this work was to follow the development of a symptom but little commented upon up to this time, a symptom, as he says, found in every healthy person in slight degree, but in some cases rising to pathological significance and perhaps dominating the entire picture of abnormal traits, thus becoming pathognomic. This symptom he at the outset calls lying. Through an elaborate and exhaustive investigation of the lies told by 5 patients over a period of years, he came to the conclusion that the form of falsifying in these cases deserves a new and separate name. It was not ordinary lying or delusion or false memory. These words expressed only part of the conception. Hence he coined the new term, pseudologia fantastica, to cover the species of lying with which he was concerned. Later German writers have also adopted this terminology. To emphasize the method by which he arrived at this conclusion, and to gain at the same time some knowledge of the problems he dealt with, we may review in bare outline his case studies. The first patient presented by Delbruck was an Austrian maidservant who in her wanderings through Austria and Switzerland had played at various times the roles of Romanian princess, Spaniard of royal lineage, a poor medical student, and rich friend of a bishop. Her lying revealed a mixture of imagination, boastfulness, deception, delusion, and dissimulation. She romanced wonderfully about her royal birth, and wrote letters purporting to be from a cardinal to herself. She fled, disguised as a man, from an educational institution to Switzerland, where her sex was discovered. It appeared that she was subject to contrary sex feelings, and thought of herself as a man. She was under the observation of Krafft Ebing at one time. He considered it at least a case of paranoia. Others had determined the girl to be a psychopath who indulged in simulations and lies. Delbruck denominated it a case of direct lying with a tendency to fantasies, delusions, and dissimulations. Delbruck from this case argues that a mixture of lies and delusions is possible, comparing such a state with dreaming and with the hypnotic condition in which one follows the suggestion of the hypnotizer and is still aware of the fact. It was evident at times that this girl half believed her own stories, then again that she had forgotten her former lies. In her, Delbruck considers perverted sex feeling and hysteria revealed a brain organization abnormal from birth. There was the instinctive tendency to lie. The second patient, an epileptic girl, had been many times imprisoned and also sent to the Charité for examination into her sanity before Delbruck saw her. Her peculiar method was to approach strangers, claiming to be a relative coming from another city to visit. If cordially received, she would stay as long as her welcome lasted, then depart, taking with her any of their possessions her fancy chose. Many prominent physicians examined her and were unable to decide as to her responsibility. Judges and others said she was a willful deceiver, a refined swindler. Delbruck, looking deeper, found that she was suffering from hysteria, having hystero-epileptic seizures with following delirium, or rather twilight states. Though her delinquencies seemed to show cunning and skill, a careful investigation revealed the fact that this was merely aberrant. Generally, her thieving was undertaken in feeble-minded fashion. Many times she stole things worthless to herself. Evidences of her pathological mentality were that she would give orders for groceries, would buy children's clothes, or send for a physician under an assumed name. She might not go back for the groceries, but after ordering them would say she would return with the carriage. The characteristic fact throughout her career was that she wished to appear to be someone wealthier, more influential than she was. Delbruck classifies her as high-grade feeble-minded, suffering from convulsive attacks and peculiar states of consciousness, with a morbid tendency to lying. She possessed no power to realize the culpable nature of her acts when she was performing them. His third patient, as a boy, appeared normal both mentally and physically. In his youth he went through the gymnasium and then studied theology. He spent money very freely on clothing and books, but at this period neither stole nor lied. After finishing his theological studies, he preached in his hometown and was regarded as a young man of great promise. Then came a change. He began to write strange letters, telling of some positions offered him. He borrowed money freely from relatives and friends who were willing to give because they believed in his coming career. When studied, it was concluded by Delbruck that this was a case of constitutional psychosis, hysteria, moral insanity, and psychopathy, all of these forms being interrelated. Outside of masturbation, begun in early childhood and indulged in excessively at times, no causal factors were discovered. He considered that this case offered a good illustration of the peculiar coexistence of real lies and delusions in the same individual. His fourth case was that of an artful, deceitful, arrogant, selfish boy, always clever in excuses, who had stolen from the age of 12, often stolen things that he threw away. Though of Protestant family, he delighted to draw Catholic insignia and embroider religious characters. He finally entered the university, always lying and stealing. At the end of 3 months he was taken home in debt 2,000 marks. He later became a Catholic. Outside a normal expense, he had cost his father 28,000 marks. By the time he was studied, he had already taken opium for 4 years, having started because of neuralgia. There had been a severe operation on account of some trouble with the teeth. It was discovered that there was contrary sexual feeling in this case also. The patient had a great inclination for doing woman's handwork. Delbruck again considered the early appearance of character anomalies and perverted sex feeling to prove a deep-seated abnormality of nervous constitution. He diagnosed it as a case of constitutional psychosis, the extent of the abnormalities showing the individual to be irresponsible. His latest patient was an alcoholic adventurer, early life unknown, who had an idiotic sister. He had lived long in America and returned to Germany full of stories of his wonderful achievements overseas. The case does not concern us except to emphasize the influence of alcohol in the development of such cases. This outline is sufficient to show the justification of his conclusion, namely, that just as in healthy people a mixing of lies and mistakes may occur, so the same combination may reach a pathological height, and one can diagnose a mixture of lies with delusions or false memories. These studies focus our attention on the following points, which are valuable to emphasize for the purpose of this monograph. The complexity of details to be examined in the life of any one patient in whose delinquencies pathological lying is a factor, the variety of cases in which this factor may occur, hence the difficulties in the way of determining the extent to which the patient is responsible for his deeds and whether he belongs in a reformatory or an insane hospital. From the standpoint of society, Delbruck's work has great use, since it reveals so plainly the menace that these liars are to their families and to the community as a whole, their unscrupulousness in financial dealings, their tendencies to bring false accusations involving families and friends alike in useless expense and litigation. German studies on pseudologia fantastica since Delbruck's time have followed the line of amplification of his views and clarification of the subject by the addition of new types. Koppen attempted to differentiate sharply and to analyze more accurately the conception of the pathological lie. He found it impossible to make an absolute separation between pathological lies and normal lies. The lies of the mentally diseased are seldom pathological. They lie, but their lies do not differ from those of the mentally sound. We cannot call the results delusional lies. Among imbeciles we find a peculiar disposition to lying, especially among those of criminal inclination. Their lies do not separate themselves either in content or in relation to the rest of their ideas from the lies of the mentally diseased. Here follows his positive contribution to the conception. The pathological lie is active in character. A whole sequence of experiences is fabricated, and the products of fancy brought forward with a certainty that is astonishing. The possibility that the untruth may be at any minute demolished does not abash the liar in the least. Remonstrances against the lies make no impression. On closer inspection, we find that the liar is no longer free. He has ceased to be master of his own lies. The lie has won power over him. It has the worth of real experience. In the final stage of the evolution of the pathological lie, it cannot be differentiated from delusion. Pathological lies have long been credited to hystericals. They are now known to arise in alcoholics, imbeciles, degenerates. All pathological liars have a purpose, that is, to decorate their own person, to tell something interesting, and an ego motive is always present. They all lie about something they wish to possess or be. Koppen offers 3 case studies. 1. A man who had suffered from many epileptic seizures came from a family in which there was insanity. He gave himself many false titles, and from his childhood pathological lying had been a prominent symptom. As an example, when he married against his father's will, he at the wedding read a false dispatch, pretending to be congratulations from his family. Koppen suggests that this individual was incapable of meeting life as it really was, and he therefore wove a mass of fantasies. 2. A young man charged with grave falsifications. He had come from an epileptic family and himself had slight attacks in childhood. He bore various pathological stigmata. Koppen considered that the patient believed his own stories about his rather superior education, and that in general his lies became delusions which influenced his actions. He diagnosed the case as psychotic, insane in a legal sense. 3. A young man, undoubtedly insane, brought forward his pathological lies with such force that Koppen was persuaded that the patient believed in them. Bernard Risch has seen many cases of delinquents with more or less marked psychopathic signs in which pathological lying was the focal point. He reports 5 cases at great length, in all of whom the inclination to fabricate stories, der Hang zum Fabulieren, is irresistible and apparently not to be repressed by efforts of the will. Risch's main points, built up from the study of his cases, are worthy of close consideration. 1. Mental processes similar to those forming the basis of the impulse of literary creation in normal people lie at the foundation of the morbid romances and fancies of those afflicted with pseudologia fantastica. The coercive impulse for self-expression, with an accompanying feeling of desire and dissatisfaction, plays a similar part in both. That the making up of tales is an end in itself for the abnormal swindler, just as it is for the normal author, seems clear to Risch. 2. The morbid impulse which forces zum Fabulieren is bound up with the desire to play the role of the person depicted. Fiction and real life are not separated as in the mind of the normal author. 3. The bent of thought is egocentric. The morbid liar and swindler can think of nothing but himself. 4. There is a reduction of the powers of attention in these cases. Only upon supposition that this faculty is disturbed can we account for the discrepancies in the statements of patients. One has the impression that their memory for delinquencies is not clear. Careful investigation proves that they do not like to remember them, and this dislike has to be overcome. 5. There is a special weakness in judgment, which for general purposes is sound. The train of thought is logical, but in ethical discernment the lack appears. The pathological liar does not face openly the question of whether his lies can be seen through. Then follows a closer analysis of the qualities possessed by pathological liars. A. Their range of ideas is wide. B. Their range of interests is wider than would be expected from their grade of education. C. Their perceptions are better than the average. D. They are nimble-witted. Their oral and written style is above normal in fluency. E. They exhibit faultiness in the development of conceptions and judgments. Their judgment is sharp and clear only as far as their own person does not come into consideration. It is the lack of any self-criticism combined with an abnormal egocentric trend of thought that biases their judgments concerning themselves. F. Psychic traumata arise perhaps through a striking reaction in the emotional realm towards external occurrences. G. Nearly all of Risch's cases were burdened with bad inheritance. He maintains that above all, these cases show instability and psychic excitability. The entire symptom complex arises upon a basis of degeneracy. Essential similarities run through all of Rich's cases. It is perhaps valuable here to cite a couple of them. His case 1 is that of a soldier who, after being released from prison at 23 years, had begun his military duty and in a short time attempted suicide. He was then studied for insanity. It was found that he gave long accounts of his experiences as a chauffeur, rendering his story with fluent details about hair-breadth escapes and other adventures. He also told at length of his love affair with a young girl. These stories were discovered to be false from A to Z. He did not clearly remember them later. The evolving of such fabrications was all along one of his chief characteristics. Examination showed no gross intellectual defect, but there were certain psychopathic signs which had been displayed from early childhood. He had little endurance and was unable to stand criticism. Emotions befitting his stories were correctly expressed by him. There were no facial evidences of conflict or discomfort. It was impossible to tell from his physiognomy that he was engaged in untruths. Mentally he was well oriented, and his thoughts flowed in orderly sequence. Despite rather limited education, he demonstrated very good style in his conversation and his letters. The train of thought was expressed coherently and logically, so well that one could speak of him as having literary ability. Physically he was quite normal. Investigation of antecedents showed that he was born of an exceedingly nervous mother, more exact diagnosis not given, and that he had a feeble-minded brother. During his school career he was considered to have quite fair ability. He learned no trade, and after stopping school would leave a position upon the slightest provocation. Before he was 23 he had been legally punished many times for stealing and had spent all told over 3 years in prison. Once before he had attempted suicide. After the thorough study of him at 23 he was placed in an asylum. There he was occupied at basket weaving and was chiefly notable for keeping up the characteristics that were peculiar to him before. He continually lied, and indeed seemed to get his main pleasure out of telling fabulous stories to other patients. Case 4 was a man of 31 years, a decorative painter by trade, who presented himself at the state attorney's office and stated that in a fit of jealousy he had shot and killed a man. Taking up the case, it was soon found that this was quite untrue, and that the man was a chronic liar. He seemed much astonished when he was told that the man he claimed to have killed was still alive. Further study of this self-accuser showed that he had been punished by the law every year since he was 16. His offenses consisted of embezzling, theft, forgery, and swindling. In all he had served about 6½ years. His lying was so much a part of his mental life that he seemed to be unable to discriminate between his real and his fancied crimes. He not only invented stories, but was much inclined to play some role created by his fancy. There seemed to be a method to his cheating and swindling which added to his undoubted pleasure in lying. His peculiar career was much furthered by the possession of a fluent style and a good memory, through which his creations were built up in most plausible fashion. He proved to be willingly introspective, and stated that his inclination to lie was a puzzle to him, and that while he was engaged in prevarications he believed in them. He always was the hero of his own stories. He further declared that inner unrest and love of wandering drove him forth even when he was living under orderly conditions. He considered that his feeling of restlessness was a weighty motive in the deeds for which he had been punished. At one time this man had simulated attacks of epilepsy and attempted in connection with these to swindle physicians and others. His schooling had been continued to the gymnasium, Untertertia. Then he had taken up his trade. His intelligence and memory were considered excellent. He had an insane brother. Vogt has made a thorough analysis of 6 cases of pathological liars, ranging from the very stupid to the intelligent. 1. A girl who had done poorly in school was unable to hold a place and became a thief. Her mother was epileptic. Examination showed intelligence not equal to that of 8 years, with moral inferiority on account of this weakness. 2. A feeble-minded girl of vacillating, weak judgment. Father insane. Her lies were marked by their fantastic nature. 3. Lively, fanciful, unstable, hysterical girl. Poor record at school. 4. Hysterical liar with peculiarities united with splendid mental ability. 5. Unusually intelligent 15-year-old, illegitimate child. Normal mother who later had 5 sound children. Father drunkard. Her lies were neither of suggested nor dreamy type. They were skillfully dramatized means to an end in her fight for social position. In the psychiatric examination, she was found mentally normal. 6. Girl thoroughly intelligent, good at figures and puzzles, with no signs of degeneracy. Vogt characterized the pathological lie as active, more elaborately constructed, more inclusive, and leaving the ground of reality more readily than ordinary lies. Such lies he does not always find egocentric. To the pathological liar his own creation is reality, so he walks securely, is open and amiable. All these cases are gifted with lively imaginations and inclined to autosuggestion. Vogt calls the pathological lie a wish psychosis. This statement opens the way to an interesting and valuable interpretation of the psychological significance of this phenomenon of the mental life. He finds many more girls than boys among his cases. Boys lie from need of defense and protection, girls more from autosuggestion. This type of lie is of greater interest to social than to clinical psychology. He emphasizes the point that very refined and complicated lies appear in healthy young people in the stress of difficult situations. Obstinate and stubborn lying of itself is no disease among children. Examination must reveal that the lie has a morbid cause. The resemblance of pathological lying to poetic creation was first suggested by Delbruck in a reference to Keller's Der Grüne Heinrich, a German novel in which the lies of a boy of 7 years, lies of a creative type of the nature of retroactive hallucinations, are described. Henriksen discusses at length the resemblance of pseudologia fantastica to poetic creation in Goethe, Grillparzer, Hoffmann, and others. In an inaugural dissertation, Anna Stemmermann presents exhaustively a series of cases. These cases were studied over a long period catamnestically. Commenting upon one case, she says, "It is worthy of note in this history that the patient in a hypnoidal condition, with headache and flushed face, crochets in a senseless way and thinks she is weaving a wreath for her mother's grave, her mother being still alive." We often meet with actions like this. Characteristic is the report of spontaneous, fearful headache, without the patient's putting this in relation to her peculiar behavior. We lay more stress upon this condition than has been done previously in the literature. We believe that this symptom is wanting in no classic case of pseudologia fantastica. Often in this condition of narrowed consciousness, the daydreams are spun and have such a power of convincing that they later make the basis of pathological lies and swindling. In this hypnoidal state, a strongly heightened suggestibility exists, and trivial external causes give daydreams their direction. The general trend of fancy reveals naturally the inclinations and ideals of the affected individual. Stemmermann also maintained that the pathological lie is a wish psychosis. Even outside the hypnoidal state, these cases are more suggestible than the general run of people. Of Stemmermann's own cases, 10 in number, only 4 at most were normally endowed. The remainder were either stupid or slightly imbecile. This agrees with the experience of previous writers. Study of her cases show that there was report of previous mendacity. 4 had been liars from childhood. She found in them the combination of the general habit of lying underneath the more accentuated form of pseudologia fantastica. 1 case had perverted sex feeling. 1 was a prostitute at 16 years. In her dissertation, some points for the differentiation of the pathological lie have been added to those offered by Delbruck, Risch, Koppen, and Vogt. The pathological liar lies not according to a plan, but the impulse seizes him suddenly. This propensity grows stronger. Under strict supervision, it comes only to an abortive attack, similar to what happens in cases of dipsomania or of tendency to rove, in which the repressed outbreak expresses itself in tormenting psychical and physical unrest. While the normal liar and swindler is forced to be on his guard lest he divulge something of the actual state of affairs, and is therefore either taciturn or presents an evil and watchful appearance, or if a novice at his trade is hesitating in his replies, the pathological liar has a cheerful, open, free, enthusiastic, charming appearance, because he believes in his stories and wishes their reality. The inconsequential way in which such persons go to work is to be explained by the fact that consciousness of the real situation is partly clouded in their minds. In any special act, it is impossible to say whether the consciousness of the lie, fancy, or delusion preponderates. Inability to remember delinquencies Stemmermann regards also as added proof of pathological lying. She speaks of another class of prattlers, chattering people that might be confounded with pathological liars from the stories they tell in full detail. But they have no system which they develop, often change their subject, and do not paint in a lifelike way because they do not believe their own stories or live in them in a self-centered manner. Of the 17 cases Stemmermann studied from the literature, Delbruck, Hinrichsen, Jorger, Riedlich, Kohl, Henneberg, Wellenberg, 10 were periodic. Of her own 10 cases, 6 were periodic. Sex abnormalities were present in 5 out of the 17 in the literature. Among possible causes of pathological lying, she places any factor which narrows consciousness and increases suggestion and weakness, such as pregnancy, overexertion, chronic alcoholism, monotonous living, long, close work, head injuries. Concerning prognosis, she finds little detailed in the literature. The general opinion is that such cases arising from a background of degeneracy are incurable. One of her cases was free from attacks for 2 periods of 3 years each, and had been blameless in an honorable position as editor for 7 years at the time of the publication of her monograph. She suggests that the profession he has chosen may be particularly suited to the talents of the pathological liar. She also ventures to state that where pathological lying is merely an accompaniment of puberty, it may disappear. The fact that so many of the cases cited by Stemmermann were clearly abnormal and found places in insane asylums makes much citation of them by us, in turn, hardly worthwhile. However, a short summary of a couple of her more normal cases will show the problems and conditions as she found them. 1. Annie J., 19 years old, father a tailor, had been employed in several places as a servant. Aside from the fact that it was stated she always had an inclination to lie, nothing more was known about her early life. She complained of headaches and fainting attacks and mourned over the death of her fiancé. She said he had gone to Berlin to learn tailoring and had died there of inflammation of the lungs. He left her 650 marks, which her mother got hold of. On investigation, it was found that this man was still alive and never had been engaged to her. She then accused her mother of taking 50 marks from her, and said that a man, purporting to be her real father, came from another town and told her she had been brought up by foster parents. Through the quarreling which arose from these various stories, Annie was taken before the police physician and pronounced mentally unsound. Then she told of another engagement with the brother of her departed fiancé, who had discovered her real mother. The latter was going to leave her 30,000 marks. He had formed a plot with the foster mother to put Annie out of the way and to divide the money. He followed her on the street and threw a drugged cloth over her head. She fainted and was carried home. She said she brought action for attempt to murder. Whether this fiancé and the rich mother were real persons is not known. Later in the same year, Annie being again at large, a new father, de Graaf von Woldau, appeared and bought her beautiful clothes costing 100 marks. He wanted to take her away, but quickly disappeared and was not seen again. When Annie told this story, she was employed by a woman who attempted to get traces of the Count, but failed. Later, this employer missed a sum of money equivalent to that spent for the clothes. Annie's responsibility by this time was still more questioned, and she was sent to an insane asylum. There she was found normally oriented, orderly, industrious, but suffered from periodical headache. When questioned in the asylum concerning her tales, she hesitated and would say, "Now I believe them and now I don't." It is remarkable in this case that her different employers believed all her fabrications and took the girl's part against the supposed offenders. For a year she engaged in a sort of orgy of pathological lying, and then this phase of her career stopped. After a few months in the asylum she returned home and later married. The last report from her mother was that she was nervous and easily excited, but showed no further signs of insanity. 2. This was a boy, Johann P., who was studied mentally first when he was 16 years old. A thoroughly good history was forthcoming. He was brought for examination on account of his extreme changeableness, his failure in several occupations, his tendencies to swindling, and his extreme lying. As a young child, his mother had to correct him for prevarications. Soon after he was 9, when both his parents were already dead, he forged a school certificate and was felt to be a bad influence in the home of his guardian. About that time he also stole money from pockets on a number of occasions. In school he was regarded as an undesirable pupil on account of his underhanded behavior, and one teacher who had observed him for long wrote that he showed marked inclination towards lying. At the time he was 15, he was somewhat retarded in school life, but was told he had to decide upon an occupation. After a stormy period, he announced he would become a gardener. After doing well for a month or so at his first place, he began to tell compromising stories about the wife of his employer. He gave himself out to be the son of a general who was going to inherit a large sum of money. On the strength of this, he managed to get hold of expensive articles he desired. A short time afterward, he wrote to his guardian he was fitted for higher pursuits than that of gardening. Soon afterward, he ran away to a large town. He now wrote that the word freedom sounded like the sweetest music in his ears. He acknowledged that he had started a career of criminality, but decided to do better. At this time he attempted to make his way by offering his compositions at a newspaper office, where they were declined either because his productions were immature or his authorship was doubted. One editor loaned him some money, but he got much more by representing himself to be a collaborator of this editor. He soon failed to make his way and attempted other things, including entrance into the merchant marine. He finally turned up again at his guardian's house, and when his box was opened it was found to contain a very curious lot of material such as money accounts, business cards, letterheads, catalogues. It was at this time that he was placed for observation in an asylum, and it was soon found that his alleged compositions were plagiarized. He claimed to suffer from headaches. Outside of that he was in fine physical condition. He frequently wrote sketches in proof of his ability. A general statement was finally made that he showed slight traces of hysteria, was a sufferer from headaches, and showed periodic tendencies to wandering and lying. No special defect in the ethical discriminations was present. He had good insight into his own tendencies. He was finally released to his guardian, and Stemmermann offered the prognosis that Johann might well develop into a typical pathological swindler. He came of a family of 5 brothers and sisters, one of whom was incarcerated for a year on account of stealing. One sister was noted for her tendency to prevarication. Several of them were remarkably unstable, at least early in life. All of them are said to have learned very unwillingly in school. One brother of the father was exceedingly nervous. Jorger presents a case of a boy of poor parents who was from childhood possessed of the idea of being a teacher. He was always a solitary child, endowed with great religious fervor. In spite of poverty, he obtained an education, studied the classics, and did excellent work. He developed early religious eccentricities, became unsound on money matters, boasted of his father's millions, spent freely as a benefactor, bought expensive books, then developed an outspoken tendency to swindling. Finally, he was adjudged insane and committed to an asylum. Commenting on this case, Jorger points out the marks of abnormality from childhood, such as solitariness and religious intensity. He was above normal in intellectual ability, but lacking in moral development. He did not love parents, brothers, sisters, or teachers. He was very egotistical. Jorger defines this as a case of constitutional psychosis. When older, pseudologia fantastica controlled him. It was like hypnotic influence. His dreams of wealth were like paranoia. His hypnotic condition grew to such an extent that there was an interruption of consciousness with following amnesia. Henneberg cites another case of a highly educated young man who told wonderful stories in childhood and later obtained money under false pretenses with elaborate deception. From an eccentric grandmother and a mother who was very excitable and suffered from hysteria, he inherited a nervous system which was not calculated to bear the strain which his own overzealous efforts in pursuing his studies and his spiritual exaltation put upon him. Hence the mental and moral breakdown. This is a very interesting case because it does not fit into the usual group of pathological liars. Wendt enlarged the field in which we may look for such cases. He finds pseudologia fantastica a symptom not only of hysteria, alcoholism, paranoia, but also of sex repression and neurasthenia. He takes a more philosophical view of the subject than previous authors. He understands by pseudologia fantastica not merely the bare habit of telling fantastic lies and what they bring forth, but rather the yielding up of consciousness of reality in the presence of the morbidly fantastic wish in its widest consequences. Since the wish, in order to exist, is not permitted to lose entirely the conscious presentation of what it hopes for, so memory and recognition of reality emerge disconnected in consciousness, and a condition described as double consciousness arises. In this state of mind, 2 forms of life run side by side, the actual and the desired. Finally, the latter becomes preponderant and decisive. Such a psychic make-up must lead unconditionally and necessarily to swindling and law-breaking. A degenerative alteration furnishes the basis from which a wish or wish complex arises, increasing in force until it becomes autosuggestion. Hence, it is pathological. Then follow the practical consequences, and we have developed on the one side pathological lying and on the other swindling, that is, criminality. Purely symptomatically, pseudologia fantastica is characterized by the groundlessness of the fabrications, the heightened suggestibility of the patient, and in its wake arises double consciousness and inadequate powers of reproduction of reality. Wendt gives at length the history of a precocious boy, the son of an official of medical rank, who had lived always with older people. He lied from early childhood. He was a chronic sufferer from severe headaches. Between the ages of 15 and 17, this boy showed evidences of literary talent, but was poor in mathematics. From a tender age he had an overmastering desire to become great. He said he wished to become a jurist because only jurists get the high offices. He entered a South German university, rented a fine apartment, stated he was accustomed to a Schloss. His father was a high state official. He later called himself Graf Friedrich Gersdorf auf Blankenhain. The young man's deceits grew rapidly. He obtained much money falsely, traveled first class with the body servants. He passed to other universities, was always quiet and industrious. After many adventures he fell into the hands of the law and was adjudged insane. Most interesting was the fact that he discussed intelligently his career. Quote, "My capacity for considering my thoughts as something really carried out in life is unfortunately too great to permit my having full conception of the boundary between appearance and reality." End quote. The family history of the above case included swindling, hysteria, and epilepsy. His fabricating tendency first reached its height at 14 years, thus showing the influence of puberty. Wendt regarded the etiological factors as family degeneracy, a wish complex which in activity amounted to autosuggestion, double consciousness, and a periodical preponderance of the wished-for personality. Bressler, in proposing 2 reforms in the German Strafgesetzbuch, undertook a discussion of pathological accusations as material using cases reported by several authors. He attempted a classification as follows. 1. Deliberately false accusations based upon the pathological disposition or impulse to lie, the content of the accusation being fabricated. 2. False accusation upon a basis of pathologically disturbed perceptions or reasoning. Content of the accusation is here illusion, hallucination, or delusion. 3. Accusations correct in content but pathologically motivated. The first group nearly always is the action of hystericals, and many are centered on sex affairs. Bressler's cited cases of this class seem merely to impress the idea of revenge or of protection from deserved punishment. A very complicated case was that of a girl who had been rejected in marriage after the discovery by her lover that she had attacks of major hysteria. She entered into a conspiracy with her mother to destroy him. She first maliciously cut grapevines and accused him and his brother of doing it. Then she slandered his whole family. A year later, suddenly appearing wounded, she accused his uncle of trying to kill her and obtained a verdict against him. Then she attempted the same with another uncle, who, however, maintained an alibi. After this, her role changed, for her mother summoned people to see her daughter lying with a wreath around her head, brought by an angel, with a scroll on which was inscribed Corona Martyri. The church now took her part, and she toured the country as a sort of saint. Later she returned to her former tactics. She set fire to a house, cut off a cow's udder, and accused her former lover of these deeds. Now for the first time it went badly with her. She was finally imprisoned for life on account of attempts to poison people. In Bressler's second group, he places the false accusations of alcoholics, paranoiacs, querulants, whom he calls a subclass of paranoiacs, and sufferers from head injuries. Besides these, he here classes the false accusations of children. The third class is so rare that it receives almost no discussion. Longard reports an interesting case of a chronic liar and swindler, a man who, on account of the peculiarities of his swindling, was placed under custody for study. Upon detention, he went into convulsions and later seemed entirely distracted. He was then 24 years old. Investigation of his case showed that his abnormalities dated from early life and were probably due to the fact that in childhood he had a bad fall from a height. When he was 23, he had served 6 months on account of swindling. At that time he had been going about in the Rhine country dressed as a monk, begging things of little worth, such as crucifixes, candles, medals, etc. His pious behavior and orderliness gave him a good reception. He sometimes took money or begged it in order to read masses for poor souls. In one village he said he had come to reconnoiter for a site to build a hospital. Some cloister brothers in one place took him for a swindler and decided he was overwrought religiously, and that he really thought he was what he wished to become. He was studied at length in prison, where he had one attack of maniacal behavior and tried to hang himself. The physician there thought him a simulator. He was excused from his military service because of stomach trouble. At that time, mental abnormalities were not noticed. After this, he again acted the part of a monk, wandering through France and Germany, living in monasteries, and being helped along by different organizations, Protestant as well as Catholic. He was arrested in Cologne when discovered to be a fraud. He lay 4 days in jail, apparently unconscious, and then appeared stupefied and staggered about. When questioned, he responded, quote, "I am born again," end quote. He spoke mostly in biblical terms and was fluent with pious speeches. He was found quite sound physically. He ate a great deal and was known to take bread away from other prisoners at night. He was sentenced for 15 months for swindling. He himself related that in youth he had seen many monks and had become possessed of the idea of being one. He was a sex pervert. The author considered this not a pure case of simulation. The patient was an abnormal being. None of his keepers thought him normal. His entire appearance, his excited way of speaking, his gestures and play of features were all striking to a high degree. His method of going about begging was unreasonable. He gained so little by it. His tendency to untruthfulness stood out everywhere. He imitated the pious as he chattered without aim. The man had lived himself into the role of a cloister brother so completely that he was not clearly conscious of the deceit. The author thinks the case presents some paranoid features with a pathological tendency towards lying. Thus, this pathological liar presents the phenomenon of a mixture of lies and delusions. From the Zurich clinic of Forel, several cases of pathological swindling have been reported at length. It must be confessed that the success of much of the misrepresentation cited in these case histories seems to be as largely due to the naivete of the country folk as to the efforts of the swindlers themselves. 2 of the cases were clearly insane and were detained for long periods in asylums after their study in the clinic. But even so, it is to be noted that one of these, when absenting himself from institutional care, succeeded in going on with his swindling operations. The 3rd case was regarded as that of an aberrational individual, with special tendencies towards lying and swindling. But the opinion rendered did not end in the man being held as insane. He was simply regarded as a delinquent, and after serving his sentence, he went his old way. These cases are interesting to one who would learn the extent to which swindling among a simple-minded population can be carried on. From French sources, we have not been able to collect such a wealth of material as we found in German literature. One study by Beltrude and Mercier compares favorably in elaborate working out of details with the work of German authors. A Corsican boy, from childhood moody, fond of adventure, inclined to deception, had attempted suicide several times before he was 20 years old. He was married at that time and went to France, where he was employed in several towns. His life following this included an immense amount of lying and swindling. He had a mania for buying costly antique furniture and jewelry, which he obtained on credit. He frequently disappeared from localities where he was wanted on criminal charges and changed his name. He wandered through Italy, Tunis, and South America. Returning to France, he was taken into custody and mental troubles were noted. He showed delirium of persecution and was removed to a hospital for the insane. Experts studied him for a year before they could decide whether he was insane or merely simulating insanity. Finally, they thought he was not simulating. A few months later he escaped, went to Belgium, Italy, Corsica. Turning up at a town in France under an assumed name, he was arrested again and elaborately examined. At this time he had frequent attacks of unconsciousness and frothing at the mouth. At times he was melancholy. Summarizing the case, the authors say that the psychic peculiarities of the patient were congenital and included habitual instability of character with defective development of the ethical sentiments and tendency to deceit and swindling. Epilepsy here is, of course, the central cause of mental and moral deterioration. From a pedagogical point of view, Ruma tells of the marvelous stories of a 5-year-old boy in the Froebel School in Charleroi. His stories were generally suggested by something told by the teacher or other pupils. He referred their anecdotes to himself or other members of his family and greatly enlarged upon them. He also made elaborate childish drawings and gave long accounts of what they meant. Going into the question of heredity, Ruma found this boy's mother very nervous. The father was a good man. She had worked steadily at the machine before his birth. 2 of their children died with convulsions. Of the 2 living, one was well behaved but weakly. Ruma's case had stigmata of degeneracy in ears, palate, and jaw. Tested by the Binet system, he did 3 out of 5 of the tests for 5 years satisfactorily. He was easily fatigued, refused at times to respond, said he had been forbidden to reply, said he would be whipped if he did. In school he was always poor at manual work, wanted to be moving about, to go out of classes on errands, was always calling notice to himself in a good or bad way. He paid very little attention to his lessons, played alone or with younger children, leading them often into mischief. It was found that he got much of his material for stories from his older brother, who told him of robbers and accidents. From his good father he got the form of his tales, because the father was wont to tell him stories with a moral. In summary, Ruma stated that this child possessed senses acute beyond the average, and was of very unstable temperament, refusing regular work, not submitting to rules, rebelling at abstractions. There were evidences of degeneracy on the mother's side. Remedies in education for such children are suppress food for imagination, such as came from the stories of father and brother, direct perceptions to accurate work, systematize education of attention, exercise the senses, use manual work such as modeling and gardening, give lessons in observation in the classroom and on promenades. Mounier tells of 3 girls in a well-known Parisian school who indulged in wonderful tales. The first, in the intermediate grade, told stories of the illness of her father to account for her not having her lessons. The second, 11 years old, said that her mother was dying. She came bringing this news to the teachers at 2 different periods of her school life. She was a calm, thoughtful, analytical child with no reason for lying. Family history negative. The third, 13 years old, told of an imaginary uncle who was going to collect funds for needy children. She kept up the deceit for 2 months. She was an anemic, nervous, hysterical child with a nervous mother. Mounier calls these cases of systematized deliriums. The development of such delirium annihilates, so to speak, the entire personality of the subject, and his entire mental life is invaded by abnormal extra and introspection. The delirium commands and systematizes all acquired impressions. There is a veritable splitting of the personality in which the new ego is developed at the expense of the normal ego that now only appears at intervals. End of chapter 2. Read by Mary Schneider.